I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, amid heavy assaults on Kyiv and Zaporizhzhia, while Ukraine attacks more energy sites deep inside Russia, we hear about the evacuation of families from eastern Ukraine, and about the half-marathon Dom ran to help raise money for a charity trying to help. Plus, we reflect on the historic election result in Moldova, and why it's bad news for Moscow.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Erstens, wir verteidigen mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Monday, the 29th of September, 3 years and 219 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by the Telegraph's Associate Editor of Defence, Dominic Nicholls, and sit down with the co-founder of one of the charities we're supporting in David Knowles' memory, Ada Wordsworth. But first, over to Dom for the latest military updates.
So the sort of upshot from the weekend was it just continued the theme of recent months, actually. So if you've got somewhere else to go right now, that's it. Nothing particularly new. Russian aerial strikes across Ukraine, very small moves west in the Donbass, and Ukraine continues to pile into Russia's energy, in particular oil infrastructure. So continuing the theme, as I say. Now, as predicted, given how the fuel crisis in Russia is really starting to bite now, and the political landscape has moved to a less favourable position post-Alaska for the Kremlin, these mass aerial strikes and the Donbass grind is basically, in my view, all that Russia is capable of right now. They are hanging on. They are hoping for a change in the external environment, hoping for a change in the political environment or a collapse in Kyiv. So, it's not in Russia's gift anymore, is what I'm saying. I think strategically, the course of the war at the moment, and it does change regularly, but strategically, I think the course of the war at the moment is in favour of Ukraine. Anyway, let's have a look. Over the weekend in Russia, Ukrainian attack drones struck the Chingvatovo pumping station. That's on the Almatyevsk oil pipeline, about 1,000 kilometres east of Ukraine. That's a major supply link to the Russian refineries in the western part of the country. The local governor there said the facility had been damaged and pumping operations suspended. A little bit out of sequence, but there'll be a reason for that in a moment. Today, the Kharkiv electrical components plant in Russia's Bryansk Oblast is reportedly burning as we speak, following a drone attack last night. This comes from local media in the region there. Bryansk is that bit of Russia, Bryansk Oblast, that bit where Russia, Belarus and Ukraine meet. Now, there's speculation that that strike was conducted by HIMARS, High Mobility Artillery Rocket System, the long-range guided missile, a multiple launch rocket system that Ukraine has bought / and been gifted from a number of countries, mainly the United States. Then yesterday, Ukraine also hit the Belgorod heat and power plant and 2 electrical substations just north of the border with Russia in Belgorod Oblast. That's the bit of Russia directly north of Kharkiv Oblast. So Belgorod Oblast Governor Vyacheslav Gladkov, he confirmed a strike on the region's critical infrastructure, saying that there had been, quote, significant power outages as a result. There is speculation also that that strike was conducted by Ukraine using HIMARS missiles. Now, why do I keep harping on about all this? Because if true, it's thought that Ukraine would have had to receive specific permission from the United States to use HIMARS across the border for these kind of strikes. Now, on this issue, this sort of hot topic of weapons permissions, US retired General Keith Kellogg, Donald Trump's special envoy for Ukraine, he was doing the rounds last night. He was on the Sunday briefing on Fox News yesterday, and he said, this is a quote, "Russia is not winning the war. They," that's Ukraine, "have an opportunity to challenge Russia much more aggressively if they get the weapon systems to do so. They've never asked for US troops. They don't want US troops on the ground. What they do want is the armament, the ability and the authority to use it." He was asked, has Ukraine already been given that authority? And he said, reading what he, that's Donald Trump, reading what he has said, and Vance and Rubio, the answer is yes. Use the ability to hit deep. There are no such things as sanctuaries. So this whole issue at the moment about weapons permissions against the backdrop of, is Ukraine going to be allowed to use US-supplied Tomahawk cruise missiles? We know, the Telegraph reported, Joe Barnes reported last week, how that was thought to have been part of their discussions on the margins of the UN. Zelensky asking for Tomahawks. Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, he also was on the airwaves in the last 24 hours, and he said that even if the United States will supply Ukraine with Tomahawk cruise missiles, it will not change anything on the battlefield. Now, I'll point you to a comment by Kyiv-based foreign policy security analyst and friend of the pod, Jimmy Rushton. He commented on those words from Peskov. He said, Peskov here is signalling the inevitable Russian climb down when Ukraine is eventually supplied with Tomahawk cruise missiles and uses them effectively, as we have previously witnessed with HIMARS, Storm Shadow, battle tanks, ATACMS, F-16s, etc. Jimmy Rushton says this is a familiar pattern. Russia makes outlandish threats before a weapons system is supplied to Ukraine, usually invoking World War III. Then, when the system is eventually sent, Russia will claim there's actually no need to respond because that system is so ineffective, it doesn't change anything. So just interesting to see that against the backdrop, as I say, of this current debate or consideration about whether or not US Tomahawks will be gifted to Ukraine and whether or not there has been a shift in Donald Trump's position about those policy permissions to strike deep inside Russia. Now, in Ukraine, let's look back over the weekend. Overnight Saturday, Sunday, 4 people were killed in a 12-hour overnight Russian bombardment of Kyiv and elsewhere that left, well, certainly in the capital, a quiet residential area flattened. Photographs of the aftermath showed a rubble-strewn road with the roofs of several buildings in Borshchankivka, that's west of the city centre, caved in and cars buried in debris. President Zelensky said that the what he called a savage attack had lasted more than 12 hours and involved 500 drones and more than 40 missiles. Authorities said a hospital and a residential neighbourhood were among the sites hit during this bombardment. Timur Chikachenko, who's the head of Kyiv's city military administration, said a 12-year-old girl was among the dead. Writing on Telegram, he said the Russians have restarted the child death counter. Vitaly Klitschko, the mayor of Kyiv, said 2 of the fatalities in the city had come after a fire broke out at a hospital. A nurse and a patient were said to have been killed due to the attack on the Institute of Cardiology, authorities have said. Andrei Sybiha, Ukraine's foreign minister, writing on X, said Russia launched another massive air attack on Ukrainian cities while people were sleeping. Again, hundreds of drones and missiles destroying residential buildings and causing civilian casualties. Now, calling on the world to, quote, back President Trump's efforts and halt any Russian imports, President Zelensky said Ukraine would continue its policy of trying to disrupt Russian energy exports in response to such strikes. Ukrainian sanctions, as I've heard them called by certain wags in Ukraine. Now, on these strikes, Zaporizhzhia city was also hit. Oblast Governor Ivan Fedorov said that at least 38 people were injured, among them 3 children, 2 seriously, 1 from a mine explosion, and the second from carbon monoxide poisoning. 9 houses and 14 high-rise buildings were damaged in total. Now, Regina Karchenko, who's the acting head of Zaporizhzhia City Council, on Sunday morning after the attack, said yesterday's life still smoulders in the windows. Someone's photographs, children's toys, books. People have suffered and the city is counting its wounds again. These overnight attacks also saw Shahed-type drones hit throughout the rest of Kyiv Oblast and Zaporizhzhia Oblast, Khmelnytskyi Oblast, that's in the west of Ukraine, just north of Moldova, and Sumy. Now, Poland scrambled fighter jets in response to this mass attack. Authorities closed the airspace over Lublin and Rzeszów. Lublin is right over in the east, near the border. Rzeszów is the airbase down in the southeast. That's the main air hub for weapons and other aid going in or via Poland into Ukraine. Authorities said these closures were due to unplanned military activity relating to ensuring state security. You'll find a lot of images on social media of people sheltering in metro stations throughout Kyiv and taking shelter elsewhere. But overall, it was a fairly typical night, which is not the first time we've reported of this. And these were, quote unquote, just hundreds of drones hitting across the country. But just have a think about this. The first air alerts went off at 2:25 a.m. This came from the Kyiv City Military Administration, warning that Russia had launched a series of MiG-31 jets. They're the ones that fire the glide bombs in. And then a little bit later, Ukraine's Air Force issued another warning at 3:52 a.m., saying that Russia had likely launched Tu-95 bombers from the Engels air base right out, about 1,000 k's east or 700 k's east of Ukraine. So just a typical night. Sunday night, getting ready for work the next day, you're woken up at 2:25 and then later again at 3:52. This is what Russia is trying to do. They're just trying to terrorise the public. Anyway, on the ground across Ukraine, little move, as I said earlier. Ukraine's Commander-in-Chief, General Alexander Syrsky, said this morning that several Russian military units had been encircled near Dobrapia. There's been reporting over the weekend that I saw suggesting that it was a coordinated Ukrainian movement to slice up and surround what's left of that Russian advance north in the vicinity of Dobrapia. That effort has been going on for a few days. Military sources in the Donbass, in a formation that's fighting there, said that they were part of that push to this coordinated encircle and sort of break it apart. Now, today you'll also see social media of a Russian helicopter shot down by a Ukrainian first-person view drone. This drone apparently flown by the 59th Brigade of Ukraine's Unmanned Systems Forces, reportedly happened earlier today. Initially said to have been an Mi-28, so an attack helicopter, but I thought it was a HIP, an Mi-8 or the more recent variant, the Mi-17. I think that's now what a lot of other people are saying. I mean, it is. That's what I've seen, unless I'm totally offbeat here. It's not an Mi-28, it's a HIP. The aircraft basically flies into the drone. The drone hits it on the starboard side, just where all the stores are, on the outside of the aircraft, the pylons there. And then it piled in. It had a very fast run on landing, lots of flames underneath the aircraft, lands in a pile of dust. Doesn't seem to tumble or explode, but then there's imagery very soon after that of it absolutely in a ball of fire. No idea if anyone got out of it. An Mi-8 does then fly over the incident, which may be where the confusion comes from, but it's definitely a HIP. This was said to have happened in Konchanivka, that's in Donetsk Oblast, so about 20 k's southwest of Pokrovsk, where the front line is there. The 59th Brigade of Ukraine's Unmanned Systems Forces said in a statement, "Whoever flies there for a look, be prepared. And for the future, do not give us any surprises from the air. It will cost you dearly." In the last 24 hours, attacks have continued. 3 people killed and 70 injured across the country. And just finally for me, unidentified drones over the weekend were spotted over the Swedish archipelago of Karlskrona. That's a few kilometres, well, they were seen just a few kilometres away from a Swedish naval base. This is right down on the southeastern tip of Sweden on the Baltic Sea. It comes as President Zelensky said yesterday that Russia's shadow fleet of oil tankers are being used to launch and control Russian drones over European cities. He was citing intelligence reports. So in his evening address last night, he called for additional sanctions on Russia and said, "It is especially important that the sanctions hit Russia's energy trade and the entire infrastructure of the Russian tanker fleet painfully. This is further evidence that the Baltic Sea and other areas should be closed to Russian tankers, at least for the shadow fleet." And that is us up to date, Francis.
Well, thanks, Dom. Good to see you walking and less red in the face than you were after the half marathon yesterday. More on that later. But let's start with by far the most important news out of Europe. Moldova's ruling pro-EU party has won that critical parliamentary election to keep the country out of Russia's orbit. As final results firm up, the President Maia Sandu's Party of Action and Solidarity garnered more than 50% of the vote, compared with 24% for the pro-Russian Patriotic Bloc. That means it will retain its majority. The Russia-friendly Alternativka bloc came third, followed by the populist Our Party. Yet the pro-Russian Patriotic Bloc co-leader sought to claim victory last night, calling for protests outside of the parliament. We understand they've just taken place and could only muster 300 people and lasted about 20 minutes, reminiscent of that staged one we saw in person during our visit to the country, featuring people bussed in for a photo op. Now, Russia has long attempted to sway elections through widespread vote buying in Moldova, and this time was no exception, with Sandu's national security advisor saying election infrastructure and government websites had come under cyber attack and that fake bomb threats were called into polling stations in Moldova, Romania, Spain, Belgium and the US in an attempt to stop pro-EU diaspora voters casting their ballots. This is a critical result for many reasons. Holding on to its parliamentary majority will allow the party to keep Moldova's EU bid on track, a process still expected to take years. Because of that and Moldova's geographical location, wedged between Ukraine and Romania, European leaders are breathing a huge sigh of relief this morning. To quote EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, "Moldova, you've done it again. No attempt to sow fear or division could break your resolve. You made the choice clear: Europe, democracy, freedom. Our door is open, and we will stand with you every step of the way. The future is yours." The Polish Prime Minister chimed in too. It took real courage of the Moldovan nation and Maia Sandu personally to win this election. Not only did you save democracy and kept the European course, but you've also stopped Russia in its attempts to take control over the whole region. A good lesson for us all. So Donald Tusk there. To our Moldovan listeners and friends, we'd love to hear from you. When we were there, we rather enjoyed your local beer named the Chisinau. We dubbed it the Chisinau or simply the Chizza. Are you clinking them tonight? We'd love to know. Now, moving on, in another embarrassment for Moscow, Russia has failed in its bid to win back that seat on the UN Aviation Agency Council after facing firm opposition from the EU. Moscow immediately demanded a repeat round of voting after falling short of the support needed to return to the International Civil Aviation Organization's 36-member council. Just as a reminder, Russia was stripped of its seat in 2022 after illegally seizing foreign leased aircraft during the war in Ukraine, and returning to the council, further to its symbolic value, would have helped Moscow legitimize its attempt to re-register hundreds of leased aircraft stranded in Russia after the airspace was closed, and potentially end sanctions of aircraft components. So this is another win to add to the score sheet for Ukraine. On that subject, I'd recommend a piece in the Financial Times by the historian Yuval Noah Harari, simply named "Why Ukraine is Winning the War." It provides a really excellent summary one can share with people of the sorts of facts beyond the narrative pushed by Russian propaganda. As he writes, in 2025, at a cost of hundreds of thousands of soldiers, the Russian army has so far managed to capture just a thin sliver of frontier zone amounting to around 0.6% of Ukraine's total territory. At the rate they've been going in 2025, it would theoretically take the Russians around 100 years and tens of millions of casualties to conquer the rest of Ukraine. In fact, in August 2025, Russia controlled less of Ukraine's territory than it did in August 2022. In 2025, the weakest link in Ukraine's defences still lies in the minds of its Western friends. After 2 weeks that have seen Russian jet incursions into Estonia and Russian drones over Poland and Romania, and perhaps also Denmark, Europeans should reflect on the fact that if Russia attacks Europe tomorrow and the US chooses to stay out of the fight, Europe's biggest military asset will be the Ukrainian army. It is impossible to tell how the fight will develop, since it depends on future decisions. But in one crucial respect, the Ukrainian victory is already decisive and irreversible. It is already clear that Putin has failed to achieve his chief war aim, the destruction of the Ukrainian nation. We'll link to that in the show notes, a welcome antidote to some of the more pessimistic opinion pieces of late. I'd also recommend again Harari's book Homo Deus, which makes a convincing case that in the coming era of AI and biotechnology, modernity's focus on individualism may be challenged again. Powerful algorithms and data-driven systems may know us better than we know ourselves, subtly undermining the idea that the individual is the best judge of their own interests. It sounds dystopian, but he makes a strong case with profound ramifications for democracy. And staying on the subject of the future, 2 Russian satellites are currently shadowing ones used by the German armed forces, and what the country's defence minister Boris Pistorius is calling another escalation. He warned in a speech over the weekend that Russia and China have expanded their capabilities for warfare in space rapidly over the past years. They can disrupt satellite operations, blind satellites, manipulate or kinetically destroy them. Russia's behaviour, especially in space, poses a fundamental threat to us all, he said, one we can no longer ignore. Satellite networks today are an Achilles heel of modern societies. Whoever attacks them paralyses entire nations. As James Rothwell and Kieran Kelly underscore for The Telegraph, historically, Germany has been hugely dependent on Russian space expertise due to the GDR, creating a dependency on Russian space equipment and expertise which Berlin has only relatively recently tried to shrug off. Now, staying with airspace, you'll recall we had Sophia Yan on the podcast recently to talk about her investigation for The Telegraph, which showed how Chinese firms were providing key components for Russian drones. Well, Reuters have gone one further, exposing a weapons program in China to develop and produce long-range attack drones for use in the war, according to two sources from a European intelligence agency. IEMZ Kupol, a subsidiary of a Russian state-owned arms company, has developed and flight tested a new drone model called G3 in China. Fabian Hines, a research fellow at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, said that the delivery of UAVs from China to Russia, if confirmed, would be a significant development. If you look at what China is known to have delivered so far, he says, it was mostly dual-use goods. It was components, subcomponents that could be used in weapons systems. But what we haven't really seen, at least in the open source, are documented transfers of whole weapons systems. So another story worth monitoring, and which speaks to the argument made by yet another former intelligence chief, this time an ex-head of MI5, that the West may already be at war with Russia. Baroness Manningham Buller, who led the security service between 2002 and 2007, cited cyber attacks, espionage and covert operations as evidence for her claim. The sheer number of intelligence chiefs, past and present, voicing this is less a chorus than a full choir these days. Yet Western leaders still seem stubbornly hesitant not to respond accordingly in terms of their overarching approach to dealing with Moscow. Historians of the future may find this baffling. I know I certainly do. But now, the moment you've all been waiting for. Dom suffering through that half marathon in support of our two fundraisers, in memory of the creator of this podcast, David Knowles. Adélie was at the start, and you'll also hear the voice of Kay, David's mother, and Louisa Wells, head of audio at The Telegraph. Enjoy.
Dom, it's 8:30 in the morning. You're going to be running in half an hour. What are you doing right now?
Panicking, trying to wonder what choices I made in my life to bring me to this point, looking for an exit, trying to create a diversion so everyone looks the other way when I hide behind a tree. Yeah, normal stuff really.
Are you a bit angry at David for making you do this?
Little rabbit, I know he's there laughing, as will Francis be laughing at the halfway point. He says he's going to meet us there for a water stop and he's going to film us, which was very, very good of him. I think I'm looking forward to seeing him at the halfway point. I'll be very sweaty by then. I might have to shake myself off a bit, like some sort of, Labrador just come running out of the stinky swamp.
I feel like you need to give him a really big hug when you see him. It'll be annoying because you'll be very, very sweaty.
Well, my tactics are I'm going to go for a high five because firstly, if it works, there'll be a huge slap and sweat will go everywhere. And secondly, if it doesn't work, it'll be worth it just to watch Francis Dearnley try and attempt a high five. The thing is that they're so well supported, all these runs are so well supported. The last one I did, you got all these really encouraging people yelling and offering jelly babies and holding signs. It was very London, the last one I did, the Hackney half marathon. Somebody's holding a sign saying pain is just French for bread. It was all very sort of, very, very London. And then also very London at the 9 mile point, so just when it's really starting to bite, after all this real encouragement from the crowd, there was a guy there who must have hired it in the shop because it was absolutely inch perfect. He was wearing a full head-to-toe devil's costume, horns, trident, the lot, holding a sign saying, just give up. Just give up.
That's the best.
Just give up.
I love it.
Aww.
So tempting.
Okay, how are you feeling?
A bit nervous, but quite excited actually. We have a team of 28 runners and sadly a few have had to drop out because of injuries, but it's just amazing, the support, quite emotional as well.
Yeah, I can imagine. How is the fundraising going?
Pretty well, actually. I think we're nearly at our target for the British Heart Foundation. So thank you to all the listeners. I mean, it's just so moving to read the comments. I mean, just incredible. So, thank you so much to all of you listening. It's just amazing. And for your support to Dom and Adélie and Francis, because I know they really appreciate it.
Is there anything you want to share about David or about what it means to be here?
Yes, when you have a trauma like this, I think doing something to raise money is obviously one way of helping cope. I think the kind of literally international support we've had is helping us. I can't say it has helped us because it's still pretty raw, really, and a year is nothing. But David he just had such zest for life.
Louisa, what just happened?
So, someone just ran past and said, "My name's David," and gave us all high fives.
Different David, but our David would have loved that.
Dom!
Hey! Right. Blinken, you'll miss him. By the way, he's only jogging. Dom, how are you feeling?
Yeah, all right. Looking forward to a beer.
Yeah.
You got a beer?
No, I've got beer. I've got water. I've got some sweets for you as well.
Oh, go on, think of a sweet.
Hang on a minute.
God, take it.
Hang on.
Look, I'm missing the one.
There you go, look.
I don't need a packet of sweets in my mouth. I thought you were going to give me one jelly, baby. You give me a packet.
You can have them as a little storage thing for the run. Do you want me to order you an Uber for the next bit?
I'll order you an ambulance if you carry on like that.
Right, see you in a bit. Good luck.
Thank you.
Big cheers from everyone as they make their way towards this final few steps.
Well done, Dom. Half marathon in 2 hours. How are you feeling?
Yeah, I don't know. Next time I say this is a good idea, just, sit me down, give me a cup of hot cocoa, say, it'll all be fine, it'll pass in a minute. Oh, God. Hit the wall at 9 miles. I was just hanging on after that. Yeah. Still, I've got a nice chocolate something and some nutty something. So I'm going to sit under a tree and undo all that good work.
All for a good cause.
Yes, indeed. But some causes can be too good, if you ask me, right now.
Rumour has it he's still sitting under that tree. Thanks to everyone who's donated to the fundraisers so far and to the many listeners who came to say hello yesterday. You'll hear more about that run in this week's newsletter, which, as ever, we'll link to in the show notes. If you're not signed up, it's free. It has maps of the front lines, reflections on the issues we don't have time to discuss on air, and also what we're reading outside of our work on Ukraine. This week, for instance, I'll be reflecting on books about psychology. All I'll say is, I wish I'd read Jung when I was young. It's life-changing. And speaking of life-changing, we end this episode by speaking again to Ada Wordsworth, the co-founder of KHARPP, one of the charities we're fundraising for. She explains how your donations are changing lives in Ukraine and offers candid reflections on how the shifting nature of the war is forcing many more to permanently leave their homes. Please do listen. Well, Ada, welcome back to the podcast. Always a pleasure to see you. You've just returned from Ukraine where you've been based for the past 6 months, you were saying. So a long innings, but welcome to London and to Telegraph Towers. When we last heard about the work of KHARPP, you were fundraising support to rebuild homes and help communities in situ in Kharkiv Oblast. But I think it's fair to say quite a lot has changed in terms of the dangers and consequently the nature of the work that you do. Perhaps you could just summarise what's changed over the last, year and a half or so.
Yeah. As you said, we were working predominantly in Kharkiv Oblast doing rebuilding. The areas that we were working were focused between Kharkiv and the border, quite a tight collection of villages in that kind of 30-kilometre distance. These villages had been targeted very heavily at the start of the war. A lot had been occupied, or the ones that weren't occupied were on the front line. Following the liberation by the Ukrainian armed forces in autumn 2022, they became very quiet. They really weren't being targeted. Life started to return to them, and that's when we started doing this rebuilding work there. Things first started to change, I would say, last summer with the beginning of the Russian reoffensive. Villages that we were working on started being targeted. There were real worries that they would be occupied. That thankfully did not come to pass. But things became more dangerous there. We paused work at that point. This spring, things took a real turn for the worse, as they did in a lot of parts of the front line. It was when I was in Kharkiv Oblast working this April that there were first reports of FPV drones being seen in the villages that we were working in. At which point it just became obvious that it just wasn't feasible to keep working there. We had to pause work there at that point, and that whilst the proliferation of FPV drones in that area right now is still pretty low, it's only really going to go in one direction at this point until the end of the war. We then had to start thinking about what to do instead. I was aware that I wanted to keep focusing on rebuilding. And speaking to friends, I sort of became aware of a trend which is ongoing where people who are leaving Donetsk Oblast, understanding that it's very unlikely that they'll be able to go back to these places, are deciding that instead of renting accommodation, they want to put all their savings together, gather the entire family, grandparents, brothers, sisters, put all their savings together to try and buy a property elsewhere in Ukraine, somewhere safer, generally on the right bank of the river, where they feel like they'll be able to build a more secure life. Mostly the amount that people are gathering for this purpose is kind of between 1 and 10,000 euros. It's a really, really small amount, and it's enough to buy something, but what you're buying with it isn't a home which is functional to live in. It's homes without running water, without electricity, without heating. We've had homes which have no floors, homes which have no walls. A lot of the time it's kind of shacks. We decided to shift our focus to supporting people in that situation, people who have moved away from the front, who are trying to make a new life for themselves somewhere else, in ensuring that they're able to do that in the most kind of dignified way possible and in the safest way possible. Having fled the front line, that they're not then going to die in the winter because they have no heating in their home and there are no windows.
And are there any cases of individuals that have particularly stuck out to you? Because it must be extremely emotional for people leaving their family homes. And, it's one thing to leave fleeing and think you might come back, but quite another to feel that you're having to plant roots because your home is, in a sense, lost.
Yeah, completely. One case which has really stuck with me and where we're still working with this family, it's a family from a village called Novopavlovka, one of the villages furthest east in Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. And so it's a village where people felt this kind of sense of safety because they were in Dnipropetrovsk Oblast and not in Donetsk Oblast, and they sort of felt that that was in some way going to protect them. And then this year and the end of last year, it became very clear that that wasn't the case as the fighting moved into that area. And so this family, a mother and her child, her husband is fighting, his parents and his sister, whose husband is also fighting, have all moved to another village in Cherkasy Oblast in central Ukraine. They left very, very late. They really held on until it became completely impossible to stay in Novopavlovka. And when they did end up leaving, they left kind of in drips and drops. So you had the grandparents leaving first and then the women coming later and bringing the children with them. What really struck me about these cases is when we last went to see these families, to see the work that we'd done in their homes, digging wells for them, repairing heating systems and putting down floors for them, was that, as I said, the husbands of these two women are both fighting, and they were both there when we went to see them. And there was something so incredibly bleak about the idea that these are people who are in the army, they're both fighting in very hot parts of the front, who are having to come back not to their own homes. They can't go back to their own village because their village is now in the front. They're coming to this completely unknown place in a completely different part of the country, and then are having to see their wives and their children living in homes without water, without electricity, without heating, without flooring, without the most basic things you need to kind of make a house functional. And I mean, it's desperate. It's a completely desperate situation that people are being forced into. It kind of emphasizes the extent to which this arbitrary line that we like to draw between civilians and military just doesn't exist. The people who are in the military in Ukraine are predominantly people who were civilians until not very long ago. And the problems that are being faced are completely intertwined. That because soldiers in Ukraine have to spend so much of their earnings on buying their own cars, buying their own kind of Starlink systems, on funding all this stuff themselves. It means that they don't necessarily... Even body armour.
I've heard cases of.
Exactly, and it means that people don't necessarily have the money to then be able to send home to their families who are then fleeing the war. And so whilst you'd think, these women's husbands are fighting and they have kind of secure income, it just doesn't work like that. Another story that sticks with me a lot is a family from Mirnohrad, the town outside Pokrovsk, who evacuated last summer. A woman, her husband, her son and her parents Her husband and her parents are all bedbound. Her husband is paralysed and her parents are just very elderly and very sick. Her husband's paralysed after an operation went wrong several years ago. And her son has very severe autism and isn't able to work effectively. And so she is a carer for all these people. They had a complete nightmare with evacuating. None of the kind of organs which you would have thought should have evacuated them were able to do it because of the severity of the situation, because of the fact that her parents and her husband would all have to be carried on stretchers effectively. The best that they were offered was that someone could evacuate them to the nearest train station, which isn't very helpful because where do you go from there? Eventually they were able to have evacuation organised, and they were able to gather enough money to buy a house in the far west of Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. But it was a house which, as well as not having a bathroom and not having heating, also didn't have any windows which could open, which isn't something you'd necessarily think about, but created a situation where these 3 bedbound people were living in a house where they could get no fresh air, and the one person in the house who was kind of fully able-bodied wasn't in a position to be able to carry them outside. And so they lived all of last winter and this spring without having any fresh air at any point in an absolutely freezing house. And so for them, as well as replacing the heating system and replacing the bathroom, we've also replaced all their windows with opening windows, which I think just struck me because it wasn't something you'd necessarily think about.
And I imagine that, it's fairly inexpensive to do that, but it's life-changing in that circumstance, isn't it?
Yeah, and this is the thing of so much of the work that we do, that we're not talking necessarily really massive sums of money. The work that we're doing can range from a few £100s to a few £1,000s per house. It's all kind of very feasible to do and makes such a massive difference, but there's just such limited resources to be able to do it.
Now, I'm going to come in a moment, if I may, Ada, to the wider issue of internally displaced persons. Of course, Donetsk, I think, is seeing the largest since the start of the war. But just on this theme about the limitations of support for civilians and the family of serving soldiers, where do government programmes succeed and where do they fall short, and how can these gaps be filled?
So there are some really impressive, really functional government programs in Ukraine, specifically the Yevadnovlення program, which is an e-renewal, which enables people to access funds to rebuild their homes and can also help people with resettlement in some cases when their homes have been destroyed. It is a really, really effective program. Where it doesn't necessarily work is if your house is already on the front line and the commission can't go to see it, they can't get the evidence that it's been destroyed, you can't access the funds to repair it. The Ukrainian government is working now to try and find kind of ways around this, using drones to collect that kind of imagery of houses, but that's still very early days, and we're yet to see the full results, whether that's kind of completely implementable. And it obviously also isn't a top priority in frontline areas to be using drones for that purpose. There are much more kind of immediate uses for drones in those areas. The programme is also only possible if you have all the documentation for your house, which huge numbers of people in Ukraine don't, because, you have a property that you lived in during the Soviet Union. It was then bequeathed to you by the state following Ukraine's independence, and then you maybe just never really did anything about it. You just maybe never really thought that, your family's been living in this cottage for however many years. You never went and signed all the papers you needed to. In one of the villages that we worked in Kharkiv, only 30% of the people in the village had the paperwork for their house. And so it's a really, really massive issue, and people are working on it. Local administrations are really working now to kind of get people to register your houses, get all the correct documentation as quick as possible, so that if the worst happens, you will be able to claim this compensation. But a lot of people haven't done it on time. If you haven't done it by the time the house is destroyed, it's too late.
Well, let's look for a moment at the scale of this, because, as we mentioned a moment ago, this is enormous now, particularly in Donetsk because of the situation there, which, of course, we report day in, day out, very, very serious at the present moment. I just wonder if you could reflect on how significant this is and how that is impacting the country more widely as well as your work.
Yeah, completely. I think what's really significant in what's changed around the front line in the kind of past year and a half is that up until that point, you kind of had particular cities as focal points. You had Avdiivka, you had Bakhmut, and you had displacement from those particular cities, but it was kind of one by one almost. The way the front line is now, that part of Donetsk that it's in now, is this really, really, really built-up urban area where you have Kurakhova, which was taken earlier this year, you have Mirnohrad, you have Pokrovsk, you have Dobropilya. These are all urban centres with just really massive populations, and people are all moving at once. This year, the increase in internally displaced people in the country has been palpable in a way which I don't think it's been in a kind of, I say this anecdotally, but I don't think it has been since the start of the war, just in terms of a number of people moving from urban areas. People are also moving from areas which were, even a year ago, very safe. I stayed in Rodinska last summer and it felt completely fine. It didn't at any point there feel unsafe. And exactly a year later, and you already have Russians on the outskirts of the city. I think the impact of this was seen most acutely following that big Russian push a few weeks ago towards Dobropilya, where you suddenly have this evacuation of Dobropilya, a town which has also kind of seemed relatively safe, close to the front, but not really being targeted. You could live a reasonably normal-ish life there. You suddenly have this exodus of people from Dobropilya. Again, for the first time, I would say, since the start of the war, you had a situation where internally displaced people and refugees were sleeping on the side of the road because there just wasn't space in shelters for them. And this just hasn't been so much of a major issue in Ukraine until this point. People have always been able to find enough space for everyone. But that's really changing now. That the situation that you had before this, where there were massive house price increases in the west of the country, is now in the entire country. It's just not affordable now for people to move necessarily because of the volume of people and the impact that that's having on the market and everything like that. It's happening so quickly that it's kind of hard to keep up with it, honestly.
I can tell just talking about it it's obviously distressing. How has the mood changed among internally displaced people whilst you've been doing this work? Does it feel like this is the darkest period of the war for them?
I think it does feel like that. I think that people definitely talk less about planning to go home.
It feels permanent.
Yeah. I think that there's an understanding that even if, we saw a miracle and the front lines were frozen tomorrow, who is going to be funding the rebuilding of these cities? It just doesn't feel feasible to people now. And so people are kind of resigning themselves to this need to build a new life somewhere else. But it's very much a sense of resignation. And, I compare it to our work in Kharkiv over the last few years, where the work felt so incredibly joyful that you're giving people a chance to live in their home. People are so happy. It's this celebration every single time. It doesn't feel like that now. People are glad that they have heating or water or anything like that. But there's also a real melancholy about it. The fact that they have that is almost further evidence that they're not moving back, that they're kind of having to put down these new roots.
Mm. Do you ever find people embarrassed almost that they're in this situation?
Yeah. I think there are people definitely have.
People are very
feelings.
proud.
Yeah, of course. And people definitely have feelings of shame, and especially older people, especially older men, I would say. Like the fact that you're not able to provide this safe home for your family, it does something to people. It breaks something in people, and that's something that's really, really difficult to see. And we've had cases where people have applied for help from us. We've called them to give it to them, and they've refused it. And then they'll call us back a week later and say, no, actually, maybe we need it. And then they'll refuse it again. And we'll kind of go back and forth 5 times before people finally settle into the idea of actually, maybe we have no choice. Maybe this is our only option, is to accept this help, because we can't do it ourselves, because it's really difficult for people to find work now. There aren't enough jobs for all the people who are leaving. And that's creating a massive issue as well, that people are leaving. People who, are used to working full-time in the place that they've come from are leaving and just can't find any work, especially because people are leaving from what's effectively mining country. That's the skill set that they have, and they're moving to parts of Ukraine which are entirely agricultural-based, but that's not a skill set that people have. They're used to working in mines, and it's not necessarily transferable.
And of course, that's also, I suppose, compounded almost paradoxically by the labour shortages caused by the mobilisation drive.
Yeah. And it's these things happening simultaneously that we, for the first time this year, have found that we can't find enough workers to do the work, either because people have been mobilised or because people are afraid of mobilisation and so don't necessarily want to do work which will involve travelling a lot. But this is happening simultaneously with the fact that people also can't find work. And so it's a complete paradox that these two things are happening at the same time, but they are.
It's difficult to find much room for positivity, but it is so inspiring talking to you, Ada. And obviously we've been in touch for a long time over the course of the war. I wanted to ask a simple question, really, which is, why do you do it? I mean, I know firsthand what reporting on war can do to your mental health, but you're up close every day. We're just reporting on it, but you're dealing with people in the bleakest times of their lives, and you're in danger as well. We've even talked about that, really. What gives you the strength to do that? And of course, what gives you the hope to keep doing this?
I would say that honestly, I do it because I love Ukraine and I've found a home there and I love the people who I work with, and I want to do everything in my power to enable them to live as good a life as possible. Use my privilege of being British, of having the networks that I have, to be able to make as big a difference as possible there. Whilst things are incredibly bleak, I'm sure you hear this a lot from so many people, I'm sure you feel it yourself, as when you see the strength of human spirit that people have, the strength of generosity that people maintain even in the worst times, it does bring you hope, and it does bring you a feeling of a sense that, God, even though everything is so awful, that is a victory. You know, Russia has taken so much from Ukraine, but people are still so generous, so open, will kind of take you into their home, which doesn't have heating and doesn't have water and doesn't have any of these things, and still make you the most amazing feast you've ever seen. And there's something really life-affirming about that. There's something really beautiful about seeing that and about feeling welcomed into a community in that way. It's not a way I ever would have seen my life going. It wasn't something I ever planned, but there is something amazing about it. The feeling of togetherness that you get where you're in a country where everyone is, on the one hand, coming from a completely different space, having completely different experiences, and on the other hand, has this one unifying goal and outlook on life. There's something very beautiful about that. We also have a development in this direction, working with internally displaced people now. We're hoping to start to be able to buy properties for families. So we've done a fundraiser over this summer in collaboration with the Dnipro Center for Contemporary Culture to raise money to buy a family from this village of Novopavlovka, the first kind of large village in Dnipropetrovsk Oblast to have mandatory evacuation placed on it. We spoke with the family that I hope will be able to buy a property for this week. It's a couple with 5 children and one set of grandparents living with them, who are currently renting in Mykolaiv Oblast, but are unable to find work there, are just kind of burning through their savings. And we're really hoping that we'll be able to find them some kind of permanent home, not just for being able to give them the sense of stability that a permanent home gives in a kind of basic way, but also to be able to help them move somewhere where there are more people from their village, because right now they're the only family from their village who's moved to that particular part of the country, and just, it's a very isolating experience. And so we're also hoping to kind of be able to reunite them with their community in some way. And if this sort of pilot of that goes well, I hope it will be the start of something much bigger, of being able to really assist people with relocation in a very kind of concrete way.
Well, I feel if David were here, he would be nodding along enthusiastically. And of course, we're thrilled to be fundraising for you in his memory. And I know his family feel very proud to do so as well. I just wanted to end there, really. Of course, you knew David very well. It is a year since his passing this month. Any reflections on the relationship that you had with him?
David was the only person I know who every single time there was any kind of attack on any place that he knew that I had been or might go in the future would text me. And, I was working in Kharkiv, where there are attacks like every single day. And, my family, my oldest friends weren't staying that in touch. But, every day I would get a text from David saying, "Are you okay? Are the people you're working with okay?" And I know that wasn't just for me. David was keeping track of everything for so many people. which says so much about who he was and the spirit he had and the genuine just compassion and care he had. When David invited me on the podcast 2 years ago, it was such a massive turning point for our work. It, brought us this whole new audience. It brought us so much support. I think about it constantly, that we probably wouldn't still be functioning as a charity today if it wasn't for David's support at that moment, for his continued support over the months afterwards, keeping our work present. And so I'm so grateful to him. And I mean, just looking at what our charity has been able to do, so much of that's thanks to David, but I also know that there are countless others who have also, are also able to do the work they do because of David's work and because of obviously all of your work here. But especially, David's work finding people, inviting people, David's kind of constant commitment to finding kind of the humanity in every story, which is so important, is such an important and increasingly rare form of journalism. And I just think it's priceless. And so, I'm endlessly, constantly grateful to him for that, and also obviously incredibly grateful to you guys and to his family for kind of maintaining that support.
Well, we'll have a link in the show notes to that fundraiser for HARPP in David's memory. Do donate what you can.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ada.
Thank you so much.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest weekly newsletter. Each week, Dom Nicholls and I answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights, plus maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the descriptions for this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine Live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciate our work, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so that you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You'll find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Rachel Porter. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells, and David Knowles.
My name is David Knowles. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.